If you're a coach generating visibility, but not seeing consistent high ticket conversions, then this episode is for you. So welcome to the podcast Profits Unleashed podcast, where established coaches learn how to build authority infrastructure using podcast guesting as a predictable client acquisition channel. This is not about chasing downloads or going viral or creating more content just for the sake of it. It is about positioning back-end systems and converting visibility into revenue. Now, I'm your host, Karen Roberts, and each week we just break down how high-level operators structure their authority so that growth becomes scalable, not exhausting. So today's episode is particularly important if you're building momentum, but you're unsure whether your backend can actually support scale, because authority without financial infrastructure eventually collapses under its own growth. And that's exactly what we're unpacking today. So today I am joined by Monica Roca-Quesada. She is a fractional CFO and financial operations strategist. She helps business owners gain financial clarity, optimize cash flow, and scale profitably. With over 30 years of experience in financial operations and business transformation, she specializes in implementing systems that give founders real-time financial insight without the burden of a full-time CFO. She's also the founder of Agile Planners and creator of FineOps, a financial operations framework designed to help scaling businesses make confident, data-driven decisions. Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always so interesting to hear someone introduce your bio from that perspective, but thank you for that. That was very nicely said.
Awesome. So look, when you look at service-based businesses that are gaining visibility, whether that's speaking, podcast guesting, growing audiences, what financial mistakes do you consistently see once revenue starts increasing?
Oh, that's such a great question. What we see a lot. So I think what we see with coaches mostly is not having the correct infrastructure from the beginning. So with service-based businesses, it's not as easily defined as, let's say, a manufacturing company where you have cost of service. But in coaching, there's definitely a cost. There's cost to software. There's things that we need to look at, particularly in how coaching companies are being supported, right? Do they have virtual assistants, executive assistants? If they're outsourcing some of their marketing, those type of things are actually cost of service versus what would be deemed an expense. And I think understanding what it costs you to do what you do it's so imperative to actual pricing of services. I don't think we can really price our services properly until we fully understand what goes into providing them. And so that those little tidbits of I'm paying an executive assistant or a virtual assistant to do this, but is it an expense or is it a cost? That really depends on what they're doing for you, and understanding if that's a repeatable type of cost that you have and how often. There's nuances that I think you get so much clarity from actually looking at every line item on your financials, right? So a lot of times we are focused on how much revenue did I make, but it's equally as important to understand what it costs you to provide it, and then what your overhead is. And then what we see a lot in this industry is, what can I afford to pay myself? I don't think people are having those conversations about what does it look like. And there's a very personal kind of, it is personal, right? When we look at things like that, like you would think that your personal revenue may not be as important in this scenario, but it's even more critical as you're growing and scaling, right? To make sure that you can afford to pay yourself what you need, right? And that you're not living in feast or famine mode.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we see it a lot of the time. People will announce, I've hit 30K a month. And you think that's just the gross. There's a big difference between gross and net. And they don't always, are you paying affiliates? Are you paying this? Are you paying that? What did it take for you to get to that number? And yes, I think a lot of people don't really know their numbers because maybe they avoid it. So for you, Monica, what made you realize that most growing businesses weren't struggling with revenue, but with financial structure?
So I think it's more in the conversations that we don't have. I know it's going to sound funny because it's like, how would you know if you're not having the conversation? But I think that there's a lot, particularly in the world of entrepreneurship, right? In being a business owner, right? There's things that we all have in common, right? Like that moment of, am I going to be able to pay myself? Can I hire someone? Can I meet payroll if you're at that point where you actually have employees and things of that nature? I don't think we, as human beings, as a culture, right, we've started to have more money conversations, but a lot of this is created in our homes when we're children of the money stories that you hear, right? And I think it affects women more than men. I think men are definitely more open about what their money goals are, but I think that a lot of times we've been conditioned to believe that having conversations about money aren't right, or we shouldn't be sharing how much we earn or what our goals are. And I think that is the mindset that needs to change the most because when you think about it, there's so much information when you're surrounded by your peers, right? Like they have the same challenges that you have, but we're yet afraid to have a conversation and we're afraid to say, I'm not sure. I know what I hear a lot as a fractional CFO, or I like to say as just an advisor for finance, is I'm not sure what's really happening in my business. Like, I know we're recording things, I know we're making money, I know we're spending money, but I don't really understand the movement of money in my business. And
Mm.
that's what's keeping me up at night.
And so what inspired you to go down this path?
So I started my career. I really thought I was going to be an attorney. That's what I thought. I was a criminal justice major, and one day I started a job. I want to say I was 19 years old as a receptionist, and they started to teach me accounting. And when I tell you this was like green ledger sheets, right, like handwritten notes, and to me it all made sense, right? Seeing it, putting a pencil to paper, understanding how money was being received, how things were being spent, watching all of that to me made so much sense that I actually changed my major into accounting, basically. I think people tell me all the time, oh, you must be really good with math. And I'm like, no, I just really like money. I like understanding, right? And when I say that, like even that kind of gets a bad rap to say I like money, but money it's an exchange, it's an energy exchange, right? It's a tool. And when you start thinking about it in that way, that's when we see changes to our money mindset.
Love that. And it's for some people, and okay, maybe I'm not talking about some people, maybe I'm talking about myself here. I think there's a lot of it. A lot of people, if they are in that sort of coaching space, they are maybe natural, they're very creative. And then that side is something that they ignore, right? They're not focused on that, which is why they need somebody like you to be able to guide them through it. So if a coach is generating consistent visibility through podcast guesting or speaking, what financial systems must be in place before scaling further?
So that's a very interesting question as well. I think there's a lot of, I live in a world where I think everyone right now is an e-commerce business, right? When you think about that, the reason I say that is think about how we exchange money. Typically, there's a contract, there's an electronic payment of some sort, right? There's all these data inputs that we need to track. When does someone need to somewhat invest in an accounting system? When that starts to be consistent. I think there's a lot of coaches in the space that they're increasing revenue, they're tracking everything in Excel. At some point, that's not going to give you full visibility into what you're doing. That's the moment. Right now, there's a lot of different accounting softwares out there. We tend to prefer QuickBooks over any other, but that doesn't mean that there's not other systems that you can use. I think it's really important to almost architect or workflow out what your process is, right? So if you're at the point where you have affiliates, if you're at the point where you're paying for an executive assistant or someone to help you with marketing tasks, right? Like when those things start become repeatable, that's when you should sit down and actually map out what your system needs. I think a lot of times we jump into a system thinking that's what we need, and it may be too much or too little, depending on where you are. But that's where talking to someone who has that zone of genius is the right move, right? Like most of us in this field are not creatives, right? We're not visionaries. We're not the ones that are out there speaking and trying to attract that type of volume. But to get someone that does have that in their zone of genius, they can map out a system for you that is repeatable and scalable as you grow.
Brilliant. And that is pretty important. There's an important distinction there because a lot of coaches think scaling is about more visibility, more podcast guest appearances, more content. But what you're highlighting is that without the financial infrastructure, that growth can actually create instability if they don't have it in place. So for you, what does real financial clarity actually look like in a scaling coaching business? What numbers should they truly understand?
So I think it's, well, we often talk about revenue and different drivers, right? So there's about 16 different drivers in your business that you can kind of tweak, and they'll affect either revenue, profitability, or cash flow. And so what I think is interesting in the example you just gave, for the person that's increasing podcast visibility, they're having more sessions there. If you're not truly tracking conversion on that, then you may be seeing that you're increasing your workload, but not increasing your revenue. So one of the metrics that we watch is conversion, right? So if I'm putting out more episodes, am I getting more? What are the metrics that we're looking at for that? Like, how are we tracking that? How do we know? We've seen it happen where you produce too much. There's not enough time, right, for everyone to catch up, for everyone to listen, to soak in, right, to get that. And there is a fine line there where tracking becomes important, right? So wouldn't think that conversion, people look at it as a marketing metric, but it's actually a revenue metric, right? Because if you release too much, you may have growth. However, are you attracting the right amount of affiliates? Have you had enough time to try to increase that? If you're just busy producing, are you working on that visibility plan? Are you working on your conversion plan? And that absolutely will affect revenue. By the same token, if you're producing more, you're releasing more, perhaps you're paying for ads, things like that's going to affect profitability, right? So the more you spend on something, if you're not clear on cost, then that's not necessarily a revenue metric, that's a profitability metric, right? And so there are some things that are naturally inherent in how you look at your financials, but some that may not be. And I think that those are the conversations that are the most enlightening.
And what gets measured gets managed. And you're right. I'm sure a lot of people, they see guesting as more brand awareness or just visibility. But you're so right. If it's not converting into sales, then is it worth your time? And I think there's a massive distinction there. And so for coaches out there, at what revenue point does winging it financially start becoming dangerous?
I think that depends. That really depends on where they are with how much they depend on the business, right? So if this is, let's say, a lot of these situations start as a side job or a side hustle, right? And then they convert into a full-time thing. I think at that point, it becomes very important. If you're going to walk away from, let's say, a W-2 type of job in order to pursue doing this, then we need to really understand how are we going to supplement revenue? How are we going to do those things? Now, if you are in a point, which I think happens to a lot of us business owners, where it's, I love the work that I do, but I don't want to be involved in the day to day. I don't want to do the editing. I don't want to do caption read. I don't want to, that's not what I want to do. Then it's really important to understand, can I afford to outsource or bring someone on? I think it depends on where you want to get to and having a full plan. A lot of times we have these big, shiny goals that we want, but we don't have a plan of how we're going to get there, right? So if you have revenue, but you want to double that revenue in the next year or the next 2 years, then what is your clear path to get there? And what are you tracking to make sure that you get there? And all of that is highly personal, right? Some people are okay growing a little slower. Some people are excessively fast and want to get there yesterday, right? So there isn't necessarily one number. It's really understanding the situation as it pertains to the culture of the business.
And what would you say, what internal money belief would you say quietly sabotages scaling authority-based businesses?
I think the biggest one is not understanding how much money you need to personally make from the business. I think almost all entrepreneurs or business owners at some point have forfeited paying themselves because other things needed priority. I think when you don't have a clear understanding of what you need, then it becomes harder, because if you know what you need to make, then you can add on. Am I willing to pay a little bit, like to make a little bit less in order to get the help with editing? Am I willing? But if you don't know what it is and you just assume that if you do all of the right things, it's going to create more revenue, then that's when you're going to feel the pain of cash flow. You're going to feel like, can I really do it? But with the right plan, you likely can. Right.
What I'm hearing from you is really, you got to do your numbers. You got to do your numbers. You got to know exactly where you're at, where you want to get to, and not just go out and get the next shiny object. Make sure that this is the right time to get it, and it's actually going to benefit your top line revenue. So, what would you say is the common practical excuse, if you like, founders give for not tightening financial system, and what's the real cost of that delay?
I would say fear. Fear is what holds, right? Fear is it's our own internal money story. I don't think that gets enough. It doesn't get talked about enough. And by the time, truthfully, our money stories are developed when we're children, right? And so whatever that experience was when you were growing up is the money story that you have to somewhat change in your own head. So I think fear is, am I going to run out? Things you've experienced. This generation, or the generation I'm in, we came from parents that had corporate safe jobs. Our parents were like, get a job, work for the government, work for the city. Those were stable. You'll have a pension. They don't understand the world that we live in now. They're like, I don't understand. My parents couldn't even explain what I did for a living. They understood when I worked for corporate. They understood when I had a title. They didn't understand like where we are now. And I think what is the only thing we can do is actually set the money dates. Look at those numbers, face the fear, right? Like there's no other way around it but through it. You have to work through it.
And at the end of the day, like you say, when you're working in corporate, have the team, they have an HR department, they have a financial department, they have accounts department, they have all these things in place. So if you're really serious about growing your business, then at some point you've got to take action on this too. And outsource. Look, somebody like Monica who actually knows what they're doing. If that's not your forte, then maybe that's what you need to do. So look, if you're listening to this as a coach, building visibility through podcast guesting, look, here's the real takeaway. Authority growth increases pressure on your back end. More visibility will mean more leads, more revenue swings, more delivery complexity, more financial responsibility. And if your infrastructure isn't built to handle that, growth will become stressful instead of scalable. This is why authority positioning is only one half of the equation, and the other half is systems, financial clarity, offer structure, conversion pathways, delivery capacity. Guesting can absolutely become a predictable client acquisition system, but only when your back end is stable enough to support it. So, before you chase more visibility, ask yourself, if 10 new premium clients came in next month, would your systems support it, or would it create chaos? That's the authority difference. If you're already generating visibility, but your authority positioning and back-end systems aren't fully aligned, this is what you need to look at. You need to have the financial part of it set up. And look, if you are thinking about guesting, I am opening a few 90-day authority implementation spots this quarter. This is for established coaches who want to turn guesting into a structured, scalable client acquisition system without relying on daily content or launch cycles. But if you don't have what Monica's talking about here, the financial clarity, then first of all, maybe you need to go and speak to Monica. So if you are generating visibility, but you're not seeing predictable high-ticket conversions, then you can always apply for the intensive. I'll have the link in the show notes. And also, if you're refining your message for upcoming interviews, grab the Story Bank GPT. There'll be a link for that below. It'll help you articulate your authority clearly and confidently, as Monica did today. Monica, can you give one top tip that maybe coaches can take away from this episode and maybe implement into their business straight away?
The tip would be to have the money date, to not put it off for later, to not put it off to I'll get to it. There is such a thing as growing too quick, and it happens a lot more than think, right? People think that more money means I'll have the time or I'll be able to do the systems, and that's not always the case, right? You'll have a greater chance at success if you plan for that growth, right? If you say, hey, I'm going to implement this strategy, and that doesn't mean that you have to have, right? Because there are levels to this and scales to this, right? It doesn't mean that you need the Cadillac of systems right now, but you do need to have something that is trackable, right? Something that clearly gives you where you started and where you want to get to, right? And so I think the sooner that we sit down and have that conversation, and it also makes the experience different, right? Because it can be extremely stressful to just guess at what's going to happen in the business. But when you can track it and you can watch conversions, you can see the impact that it has, you know exactly what levers to pull in your business. And that is priceless.
And I know for me, because I certainly didn't start out doing this, admittedly, I think it's easier to remove any emotion. You can be detached from the outcome. And the truth is, if you're not emotionally detached from the outcome and you're worrying about, like you said right at the beginning, a lot of people are in feast famine mode. And even emotionally, that's not a good thing because you are then desperate for the next sale. Whereas when you're tracking everything, I think for me, in all honesty, it has been easier to step away and just focus on the thing that you need to do and be completely detached from whether that's going to work or not, because you are tracking your conversions and you can think to yourself, okay, the next one's going to be the one. So thank you for saying that. I think that's really important for people to really understand. Look, if there's coaches out there that they know they haven't got this dialed in and they need help, what should the listeners do next, Monica?
I'm going to provide you a link that talks about the different drivers in your business that you can pull, and whether you're looking at increasing revenue and increasing profitability or cash flow. You can definitely look there. There's definitely some that wouldn't seem so obvious. So just skimming over that would be a great start. And then they're always welcome. I always say, book a call, book a right fit call. And why do I say that? Sometimes you need to know that someone understands what you're experiencing, right? And having a call just to understand what your next step might be can be super enlightening. It opens the door for what's truly possible in your business.
And where can they go to get this?
Oh, right on our website, right on the homepage of agileplanners.com, there's book a right fit call.
Fantastic. And guys, if you're walking the dog, you're in the shower, you're driving, you can't get to it, don't worry. Monica's links will be in the show notes, so resort back to them. So Monica, thank you so much for your time today. It's been lovely speaking with you. And to the listeners, I'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to today's episode on the Podcast Profits Unleashed podcast. If you're